Well, it's been a quiet week in Lake Wobegon, Minnesota, my hometown, out on the edge of the Prairie. We've gotten 2 feet of snow so far. It's been a wonderful, wonderful winter. We've had some very odd ones the past few years when it remained sort of balmy on into December, and we're so thankful to have this one, 2 feet of snow. Minnesotans are conditioned to feel joy when we see snow falling. I mean, we can start complaining about it in late February, early March, but in December, it's just the most beautiful thing. The Weather Service uses the wrong verbs to describe winter storms. They use words like lash and whip, and snow does not lash, it does not whip, it falls gently, and it's a beautiful thing. Now you know that things you have been postponing for months, you can now postpone for another 6 months. And in this great quiet, it is possible to tell stories that you can't tell in May, June, July, August, September, when everybody is hell-bent on accomplishing something. No, it's a beautiful time. They practiced the living nativity out in front of the Lutheran church the other day, and snow was falling, and there was Joseph, Jack Bunson playing Joseph, and Carly Krebsbach was playing Mary. She was about 4 months pregnant when she got married 15 years ago, so maybe that's her qualification. I don't know, but she's there, the two of them, and they had 8 shepherds and 4 sheep, which is a good shepherd to sheep ratio when you're using live animals, and the babe lay in the straw in the manger, and the wise men were there, and there were angels, and it was just a practice run through. But people stopped on this snowy night. They stopped and looked at them, their neighbors standing behind the manger. And nobody spoke to them. We respected their holiness. We just looked at them. It was a beautiful thing. Snow, what's the problem? What's the problem? We're starting to get calls from relatives in San Diego and Houston and Fort Lauderdale, and they say, well, we're not sure. Now, you've gotten a lot of snow, haven't you? And they're forecasting more for next week, and so we're just not sure. Maybe we should get a refund on our plane tickets while we still can. And we're Minnesotans. We don't want to beg. We don't want to be needy. We don't want to say, please, we've been looking forward to this. This means a lot to us. This family means a lot to us. How are you ever going to know your family if you don't get together with them on these occasions? But we don't say that. We're stoics. We say, whatever you think best. We're just fine. And I suppose we are fine. If we have 15 people come up, we can fix a turkey as big as a bathtub, and then if they all cancel out, we'll just put it in the freezer in the basement, and we can get a Stouffer's frozen dinner. It's okay. We've had Christmases before, but how are you going to know your family if you don't take a chance now and then? Your great-great-grandfather came over from Norway. He came over on a ship. It was a 5-week voyage, and it was very rough. And a lot of people died and were buried at sea who had not counted on that. But he arrived, and he spoke no English, so he got a job in a lumber camp, and he worked a 6-day week, and he was cutting trees with an axe, and it was hard, back-breaking labor. And on Saturday night, he lit a fire, and he heated up a big tub of water, and he took off his clothes, and he got in it, and he washed himself, and then he put on clean clothes, and then he put his dirty clothes in the water that he'd bathed in, and he went to church on Sunday morning and heard a preacher tell him in Norwegian that he was going to hell, and that was the high point of his week. He was celibate and very poor for the 4 years it took him to earn enough money to bring your great-great-grandmother over from Norway. And he was so happy to see her. These are the people that you come from, but how are you going to know about this if you don't come and visit your relatives who have looked up your history? It's a beautiful thing, snow. People in Fort Lauderdale are missing out on it. You look out and you see the snowfall, and you remember all of these scenes. You remember standing with your friend Corinne at the top of the hill, and you're about to get on a toboggan and go down a steep hill and onto the ice of the lake, and there are some holes in the ice, but you're going to steer around them. And she's so excited, and her hands are fluttering at her side, and she gets on the toboggan, and you get on and you put your arms around her. And this is the first time you've put your arms around a girl. Your mother does not hug you. This is a big moment in your life. You're 13 years old. Years later, you are in the warming house and you're going skating, and this older woman, an older woman of 16 or 17, walks in. You don't know her. She sits down by you, and she takes off her boots and her socks, and her toenails are painted, so you know she's not from here. And she looks at you and she says, "Do you have a cigarette?" You are 13 years old. You say, "No, I left them at home." She says, "Well, I think I have one here." And she pulls one out of her purse and she hands it to you. And then she pulls out matches and she takes the cigarette between her first and second fingers. And I've got to sit down as I describe this because it's so exciting. You strike the match, and she holds your hand in her hand and brings the flame to her cigarette, and she takes a drag on it, and she gives it back to you, and you take the first drag you've ever taken on a cigarette. You're 13, and you lean back against the wall. You're grateful that it's there, and not that you're sick, you just are experiencing this more deeply than other people would. And she takes you by your hand, even though you have hockey skates and she has white figures. She goes out on the ice with you and she skates with you cross-handed a couple times around the rink, and then this other man walks up and takes her away. But you remember this for a long time, and the snow falling. You remember when you were 15 years old and you were a bus kid and you rode the bus to school and the snow was falling and the school had assigned you to a storm family in town in case the bus couldn't get you and take you home. And they were the Krugers. They lived by the lake. You walked by their house several times. They had a rock garden in back of their house, and there was a statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary. They were Catholics. Catholics. You might wind up spending the night with them, and they would hand you a crucifix, and you would say prayers you'd never said before. You would pray for the Pope, and there would be incense, and there would be candles and statues. It'd be a whole view of a whole other world. You looked forward to this. It never came, but you looked forward to it. You think of all these things. You think of these things as you watch the snow fall. You think of when you went away to college and you came home for Christmas. And your friend Corinne, now she was grown up, and she sat at the piano in her living room, and the fish tank was bubbling in the corner, and snow was falling, and there were birch logs burning in the fireplace. And she was a left-wing radical in college, but she played at the piano. And the songs that she played were On the Road to Mandalay, where the flying fishes play, and the sun comes up like thunder out of China, an old imperialist hymn. And she sang just a song at twilight, while the light is low, and the flickering shadows softly come and go. And she sang, and all of you sang. Florence and Leroy and Hilmer and Helen and Jean and Marjorie, all these Republicans sang with you, the poet, and Corinne, the left-wing radical. We all sang together in that living room as the snow came down. We sang, "Oh, little town of Bethlehem, how still I see thee lie among thy and dreamless sleep. Then stars go by, yet in thy dark street shineth the everlasting light. The hopes and fears of all the years are met in thee tonight." We all sang together on those snowy nights long, long ago. Oh, this is why men go out and sit in a fishing shack out on the ice to remember, to get away from the incessant talk and all the people who want a piece of you, and to get out there in a shack. Darryl Tollerud went out in his fishing shack. The ice is about 7 inches thick, which is not thick enough to drive on, but it's more than thick enough to walk on. He walked way out there, and here's his shack, which he inherited from his Uncle Jack, whose daughters married men from Texas and California, and they don't walk on ice. And so he got this shack. It's about an 8x10 shack, and there's a little propane heater in it. He walks out there and he sits out there to get away from his wife, Marilyn. Marilyn, why do you do that? You could buy fresh tuna flown in from the coast for less than you pay for propane and all of that. Why do you do that? You ought to get involved with people. So she took him to her book club, and he went there for 2 weeks solid, and he didn't say a word, which of course made her angry, because the book was all about gender, it was about race, it was about politics, it was about anger, these things that don't mean anything when it gets to be 20 below. They don't mean it. When it's 20 below, life is simplified. We're mammals. That's who we are. Race doesn't matter anymore. We're mammals, and nature is making a sincere attempt to kill us. And so we have to be good to each other, because we're going to need each other one of these days. No, he didn't need any of that. He goes out and he sits in his fishing shack. He didn't put a line down into the hole. He just wanted to be out there. He goes out there, and he's about 100 feet away from the closest shack, and he's wondered about this, but nobody has ever said that they heard him singing. So he sings out there, "Love me, oh, love me as only you can do. Need me, ooh, so I can go on needing you. Well, if you said that you are gonna leave me, I don't know what on earth I'd ever do. I could never make it through one day. Never, darling, without you. Sing this, it's a good song for you to learn. Love me, oh, love me. Love me as only you can do. Need me, need me, so I can go on needing you. He stands there by the hole in the ice, and he accepts a Grammy Award for Best Male Vocal of the Year. He says, "It is such an honor. I never knew I would have this honor to stand here on national television and to thank all of the people who have meant so much to me over the years, my teachers and my parents and my band, of course, but especially my beloved wife, Marilyn, who I've been with now for 47 years. No, I owe everything to her. When I met her, she was 16 years old and I was 21. And so we knew that we could not confess our love right away. I told her that she would have to finish high school and go off to college. And then I went into the Navy to keep myself from temptation. And the Navy took me directly to temptation in a number of ports. And I must admit that I fell a couple of times and felt badly about it. But I came back and I married that woman, and I have loved her ever since. We got in our car after the wedding, and we were towing about 100 tin cans on pieces of twine in a car rubbed with the worst cheese you ever smell. And we were driving fast, and we didn't even make it to the motel, people. We pulled over. There was a field of alfalfa. I tell you, I've been in love with alfalfa ever since. We ran across that field of alfalfa, and she was pulling her dress up over her head, and I got out of my tuxedo, and I threw him in the bushes, and off we went. And we've been together No, he loves being by himself in his fishing shack. So they're not going to come from Fort Lauderdale and Houston. They're not going to come. They're afraid of being lashed by a snowstorm. They're missing out on a great deal. Thanksgiving was interesting the same way. Clarence and Arlene Bunsen were just the two of them. Their daughter couldn't come. Barbara Ann, she was busy with a food shelf program down in St. Louis, and there were more volunteers than there were needy people, and so had to keep them busy somehow. And their son Dwayne has this obsessive compulsive problem, and he keeps hearing old songs, 99 bottles of beer on the wall, 99 bottles of beer, and they just can't get rid of them. And they've given him medication, but he's got a problem. And so Clarence and Arlene were alone, and next door there were the Tolleroads, and Cindy and Marilyn, and what did I get? Cindy, it's his sister, and but she was there with her husband Al, and Darryl was there, and they had 6 people as guests, and a son-in-law and daughter and 2 little boys, and suddenly there were sirens heard out in the street, and Clarence and Arlene looked out the window, and there was smoke coming out of their kitchen. Marilyn had leaned to open the oven door and see how the turkey was doing, and she had sprayed her hair with something, and there was blue flame coming from it, and people were throwing buckets of water at her, and the fire truck was pulling up, and meanwhile Darryl was supposed to put the brandy on the turkey, and it flamed up, and they hauled the hose in, and the firemen had been waiting a long time for this, and so they did their best to put out the fire, and they destroyed the kitchen and most of the food as well. So Clarence and Arlene took them in, all of the Tolleroads took them over to their house, and they discovered that the turkey was still basically okay, and the yams were in a covered dish, so they were basically okay. So this unexpected event brought all of them together, and it was very it was very neighborly. They found a lot to talk and laugh about. It was a wonderful, wonderful catastrophe. And they sat there, and afterward Darrell and Clarence sat and they had a glass of whiskey. Snow was falling on Thanksgiving afternoon, and Clarence said, "You know, the fireman who had the hose, I knew his grandfather. His grandfather was a good friend of my great-grandfather's. They were country boys, and they did terrible things back in the day. I'm not sure you ever heard about it, but they were hellraisers. They were tipping over outhouses. They did this every Halloween. They would only do it on Halloween, but my God, what a cruel thing. They would be lurking around farms, waiting for farmers to come out with their lanterns and head for the little house out back. And you know, when the need is strong, there's nothing you can do about it. You can get a chamber pot, but men don't care to use a chamber pot in a house where there are women. And so they go out and they know that it's Halloween, and so they're making threatening sounds, the farmer, as he gets into the outhouse. But he sits down on the one-holer, and once the bowels open, there's nothing he can do. And they rush in from the back of the outhouse, and they shove it over onto the door, and he's screaming, cursing them. And the lantern breaks, and it bursts into flame, and there's only one exit for him, and that's through the hole that he was sitting on. And he dives out of that hole. He squeezes through, and he lands in a pile of his own shit. And it was just unbelievable cruelty. These were good Lutheran people. But one night of the year, they devoted themselves to such terrible, terrible things. Oh, nobody would ever do that today. And that's why politics has gotten so ugly. Because there's no other way to express it. Well, Darrell said, I heard about that. That reminds me of when I was in high school, and we boys, we read somewhere about this, and we made balls out of balsa wood, and you could drop these into a toilet. We'd drop them in a toilet in the girls' lavatory, and when they hit water, they would expand, and they would block the drain so that whoever sat down on that toilet, whatever they did when they flushed the toilet would come bubbling up at them. Oh, it was a terrible thing. I did that until one day my sister was the victim, and then I couldn't do it anymore. She was so angry at me, and she threatened to tell, so I gave up on it. Well, Clarence said, you know, that's a lot like what I remember the school board meeting back about 10, 15 years ago, when the school board voted down pay increases for teachers and staff for the fourth year in a row, and the school nurse was so upset about this, she found herself a bottle of pills. This was a combination sedative laxative. It was called Sedlax. And she crushed these pills, and she put them in the coffee of the school board, and she poured coffee for 10 men sitting around a table. And she left that room with this sedative laxative in their coffee. And she came back a half hour later, and here were these half-asleep men who had loaded their pants, every single last one of them. Craig said, I heard about that. Who was that? That was Mrs. Nelson. Mrs. Nelson, she was a good Lutheran woman. Well, she was an even better Lutheran woman after she had done it. How did you hear about that? Well, her son, when she was on her deathbed, asked if she had anything on her conscience, and she said yes. And she told him about that, and he laughed his ass off. His mother lay dying and weeping, and he was laughing to beat the band. No, they did terrible, terrible things back in the day. Mrs. Nelson, she was a good friend of my aunt. My Aunt Evelyn, said Clarence. Evelyn, I remember Evelyn. Darrell said. And he looked around, and here were two of his grandsons who had been sitting listening to this whole thing. And a son-in-law was listening. They had just been listening, not saying a thing. They were getting some history of culture. Darrell said, I remember your Aunt Evelyn, she died in her sleep, didn't she? Yes, Clarence said. I mean, we think she did, but she was kind of an insomniac, so you couldn't tell. But she'd been out to eat. She'd been out to eat a big dinner and with her friends Gladys and Margaret. And Gladys was talking about Viagra, and she said that her husband Bud had tried Viagra and it only made him taller. And Evelyn laughed so hard at that, they thought maybe she had a heart attack, and they drove her home, but she said she was okay. But when her daughter Barbara came in the morning, there was Evelyn. She was lying in bed, and she was dead. Her eyes were wide open, and she had left, beside the bed, she had left on onion skin paper her last wishes, and she wanted her body to be cremated, and no church service, no eulogy, no prayers, no hymns. She wanted her body to be cremated, and she wanted her ashes to be deposited in the lake. And she asked her grandson Kyle if he would find the green bowling ball that her boyfriend Raul had given her the week they spent in Branson, Missouri. And she wanted somebody to carve a hole out of that bowling ball and put her ashes in it. And Barbara was shocked, of course, but Barbara had a big creme de cacao problem at the time. She was putting it in her coffee. She was putting it on her cereal. She was making cream of mushroom soup with creme de cacao, and so she was in no shape to make a decision. She called the mortuary, and they came and they picked up the body, and she was cremated, and they found the bowling ball. Raul! Well, Evelyn's husband, Jack, had died some years before, and she had kicked him out of the house. He lived in his hunting shack with several black labs and cases of Dinty Moore beef stew, and finally he died. And so she was free to do as she pleased, and she had taken up with a man named Raul. There is no Raul in this town. Nobody's ever met one before, but she wanted Raul to be notified. And she wanted Kyle to fly the bowling ball with her ashes, to fly it over the lake on his parasail and to drop it at the south end of the lake, where she and the late Jack had had some wonderful afternoons fishing back in the early years of their marriage. And she wanted all of this to be done exactly, and she wanted word to be gotten to Andy, to Andy Williams, to let him know that the woman who he put his arms around and kissed that night in Reno, Nevada, that she remembered him still fondly to the end of her days. So this was all to take place on a day in July. I believe it was the 12th of July, but you could look it up. And Kyle came out from the cities. He was majoring in aeronautical engineering at the university, and his family came. Barbara's mother-in-law was just horrified that she let them. You don't have to follow everything that a person says in their last will. I mean, for heaven's sake. But here was the green bowling ball, and so they were going to do it. And Kyle got in touch with his friend Dwayne, who has a 40-foot runabout with an 85-horse engine on it, and so he was going to tow the parasail over the lake and drop in the bowling ball from a great height. She didn't want to have a quiet disposal, just slip it over the gunnels of a rowboat. No. The 12th of July, they were going to do this, not realizing that this was also the day that Debbie Detmer was planning to have her wedding aboard a pontoon boat on Lake Wobegon. She had gone off to California. She had taken up with a family called the Rainbow Family, and she had changed her name to Starflower Moonbright, and the family believed that animals can read our souls better than other people can, and so out of this, she took up a career as a veterinary aromatherapist, and she earned a great deal of money, and so she wanted to marry this this friend, Brendan, whom she met at a hot yoga class, and she was going to get married aboard the pontoon boat that belongs to Wally of the Sidetrack Tap, and she had imported shrimp shish kebab flown in from San Francisco, and she had cases of Moët champagne, and she had all these delicacies and big wheels of imported French and Swiss cheese, and she had arranged for her ex-boyfriend Craig to, after the vows were said aboard the pontoon boat out on the lake, then Craig was going to fly in his hot air balloon and descend, and the boat would maneuver under it, and he would pick up the two newlyweds and fly them away just on the wind, kind of a California notion. And so this was all set up for this day in July, the same day that Aunt Evelyn's ashes in the green bowling ball were going to be flown on the parasail over, towed by Dwayne in his speedboat. And this was all going to, well, the boyfriend came to town, and they were talking about the vows, and they were writing the vows, and then he heard about Craig, the ex-boyfriend, and he just hit the ceiling. That was not going to go, and he left town, and so it was all for nothing. So Debbie figured, Starflower Moonbright figured that well, she'd just donate everything to the Lutheran Church. Nothing lost, and her life had been saved, and so she was going to head back to California, and she left it all with her parents, and the Detmers gave it all to the Lutheran Church to do what with, they had no idea, and also the pontoon boat, which Pastor Inquist regarded as the grace of God moving in mysterious ways, his wonders to perform, because that very day was the day when a group of 30 Lutheran pastors from Copenhagen were due to arrive in town, and they were going to be entertained by Lake Wobegon Lutheran Church. And he had no idea what to do for them, and now here it was, a feast. A feast had been donated, and they laid it all out on the dock in town, and the pontoon boat was there, and the bus arrived with the Danes. They had been sent on a tour of Minnesota by their bishop in Copenhagen because they had written a manifesto arguing that they no longer felt that Christ was the Son of God, and so these agnostics were sent on a fact-finding mission to see what Lutheranism really is, and there it is in Minnesota. You don't ask questions like that. You just observe it on faith, even if you believe it or not. So they all got off the bus, all of these Danes in their pastel outfits. They got off, and here was Pastor Inquist, and here was this feast of cheese and giant shrimp shish kebab and Moët champagne. They opened the champagne, and they had a few glasses of it, and they were in a festive mood, and they started to get on board the pontoon boat. As down at the other end of the lake, there was Barbara and Kyle in his red Speedos with a green Velcro belt around his chest, and he was going to fasten the bowling ball. There'd been a pin screwed into the bowling ball with a chain to it, so he was going to wrap that chain around the Velcro best to leave his hands free so that he could hold on to the trapeze. But just as safety's sake, he had himself lashed to the trapeze under the parasail, and he gave the signal to Dwayne, who was circling around in the power boat. They were down to the south end of the lake, and the Lutherans were up at the upper end of the lake, and they were all set. Raoul was there. He had arrived, and he had kind of a yellow plaid sport coat and a Hawaiian shirt and two-tone shoes, and he was smoking a wine-soaked cigar, and he had a beautiful toupee on that looked like a dead animal was on his head, and he had a boombox in his hand, and he was drinking champagne with all the rest of them. He was having a wonderful time, and he was also weeping. He was in love with Evelyn, who was inside the green bowling ball that was hanging from the chain around the green Velcro belt around Kyle's. It was hanging down between his knees. Not the best idea, but what could you say? And so he got up on the skis, he waded out into the water up to his thighs, and he got on the skis and he gave the high sign. He gave the high sign to Dwayne, and Dwayne pulled away, and around the lower end of the lake they went, as meanwhile all of the Lutherans had gotten aboard the pontoon boat. There were 26 Lutherans on a 22-foot pontoon boat, and there was a barbecue in the stern where the giant shrimp shish kebab were heating up. So it was a kind of a crowded bunch, and it was a little bit overloaded. The prow of the boat was just a couple inches above the water, but they got the motor going, and so they got momentum, and so they were able to head out into the lake. But it was a little tippy, and they were all hanging on to each other as they headed out, and the speedboat was going around the lower end of the lake, and then it took a kind of a sharp turn, and we saw two giant ducks come. Two duck decoys come out of the cove. The Incubus twins had been enlisted by Debbie to scatter flower blossoms out of the rear ends of two giant 20-foot duck decoys. And so they came across the lake, and the speedboat kind of swerved a little bit to avoid them, and then saw the pontoon boat coming towards them, and he turned even sharper, and Kyle lost his balance. He just lost his balance, and he came off the skis, but he was still lashed to the parasail trapeze with the bowling ball hanging down, and he fell into the water, and he was towed at high speed underwater. We could see his pale body go by, and we could see the force of the water tear the green Velcro belt and the green bowling ball and the red Speedos from his body as he went by, as the pontoon boat came along, and the wake of that speedboat rocked it to and fro, and one Lutheran came loose, and then the others, and they toppled off. They fell into 4 feet of water. It had been a dry summer, and there they were in the water as the naked man was being towed underwater by the speedboat, and then he rose out of the water. He rose. A naked man flying. We'd never seen this. It was like something out of Greek mythology. He was flying around as out of the little boombox that was in Raoul's hand. There was Andy Williams singing, "Moon River, wider than a mile, I'm crossing you in style," as the naked man flew overhead. And now we saw the hot air balloon coming in over the trees, and it was on a collision course with the naked man, neither of them able to steer. They were heading straight towards each other. The balloonist did the only thing he could do. He cranked up the gas, and the flame burst into the bag. It lit the bag, this blue-green silk bag. It lit it, and it burned, and big pieces of burning silk drifting through the air as the man in the basket and the burner dropped into the water, burning silk towards the naked man, who threw his body to one side, and just narrowly averted it. And then Dwayne slowed down, and he came in, and he came into shore, and they reached for the chain, and they pulled in the bowling ball, and Raoul took it in his hands, and the naked man walked in. Clarence said, "What made you think of that story?" Well, Darrell said when he was flying straight towards the pieces of burning silk, we saw this big cloud in the air where his bowels emptied, and so that's what I was thinking of. Oh, I see. 2 grandchildren listened to this story. A son-in-law listened to it. I doubt that either of them remembers all of the salient details. But there it is. This is the sort of thing that you're missing out on if you don't come to Lake Wobegon when snow is falling and people are in the mood to recall these great historic events of the past. Great historic events that have one marl. It's the central marl of Lake Wobegon. It could be worse. It could be worse. That's the news from Lake Wobegon, where all the women are strong, all the men are good looking, and all the children are above average.